Hello, everyone. My name's Emily Teacher, and today we're reading Prairie Women. One day in 1975, Joanna Stratton was exploring the attic in her grandmother's house in Topeka, Kansas, when she came across a large cache of yellowing documents stored in boxes. They turned out to be handwritten memoirs describing life on the Kansas frontier from the 1850s to the 1890s. They had been collected by Stratton's great grandmother, Lilla Day Monroe. She herself had experienced the joys and tribulations of frontier life when her family had moved from Indiana to Kansas in 1884, as the frontier period was drawing to a close. Her family settled in Wakini on a treeless tract in the western part of the state. Monroe married and became an attorney. Later, with her family, she moved to Topeka, where she practiced law and campaigned tirelessly for women's rights. So, we're talking about life on the prairie during that frontier period, what life was like, and what we know about it from really cool discoveries like these papers found in the attic and from other writings from that time. The hardships patiently borne by the Kansas pioneers remained fixed indelibly in her memory. By the early 1920s, Monroe became concerned that the vital role women played would soon be forgotten because no written record of their experiences existed. She decided to rectify that by collecting personal, written passages from Kansas women who still remembered those days. As word of her project spread throughout the state, more and more women responded until Monroe had collected 800 firsthand accounts. They were filled with vivid vignettes of pioneer life on the Kansas frontier. So, Monroe, whose papers were found in that attic, um, she was really worried that the roles that women played in keeping life going on the prairies, she was worried that no one would know how women's lives were during that time because there was really no written record of it then. So she took it upon herself to get over 800 firsthand accounts from women around that time to talk about what pioneer life was like on that Kansas frontier. It was evident from these recollections that shelter was the paramount concern of new arrivals. For a family settling in the treeless western part of the state, a plow was the chief requisite. Drawn by oxen, horses, or humans, it prepared the land for farming and provided the only building material available, sods. These were solid blocks of earth cut from strips of soil. They were used for the walls and roofs of the one-room frontier homes. Emma Brown of Mitchell County recalled life with her children in a sod house during a period of inclement weather when her husband was away on a cattle drive. The dirt roof leaked, soaking everything inside. How happy we were to have the sunshine out again, she wrote. She tells how she and the children carried everything outside to dry, but alas, her account goes on, the next morning the rain was pouring down again. It continued for another week. So, one of the biggest concerns, the biggest troubles that people had to deal with at this time was the fact that in the western part of this state, there's no trees really. There's not a lot of trees. So they can't use the wood to build houses. So they started to make it with sod, which is pieces of earth, right? Cut from the strips of soil, so the top parts of the earth. They were used for walls and roofs, but dirt and grass is not waterproof, right? So when it would rain, everything would get wet, right? And this also brings the danger of, roofs and walls collapsing and things like that. So that was a really big struggle that they had to deal with. Emma Louisa Smith of South Sapa Creek pointed out another problem caused by the lack of timber. There was not a tree or even a bush in sight to furnish us with fuel. Fortunately, the early settlers discovered an unusual source, the dried dung of cattle and buffalo. It was both combustible and plentiful. The task of collecting it was one of the many that were delegated to the children. Emma Smith concluded that the sod house and cow chips were two great factors in making possible the settlement of this country at an early date. So they needed fuel, but they didn't have wood to burn. So what they used was the dried dung or the poop, right, from the cattle and the buffalo. But the kids would go and get it and collect it, but it had to be turned into chips, right? So it had to be dried. If it wasn't dried, it would be too wet to burn. But after it dried, it burned very well. So that's what they used for fuel instead of wood. Despite the need for every pair of hands to do a share of the work, this children's schooling was not neglected. Those who could read and write taught their children at home. Later, when local settlers organized schools, Emma Handy conducted classes at Oak Creek in a dirt-floored schoolhouse built of sods. She wrote, "It had neither blackboard, teacher's desk, nor chairs. The seats were small logs, split and supported by pegs. Two small apertures cut into one of the walls provided the only source of light. The dirt floor served as a chalkboard, with a long pointed stick used to write letters and numbers." So schooling at that time, even homeschooling, if they were to learn at home, the parents would have to know how to read and write because that's what they would teach the students. If not, they would go to a schoolhouse made of dirt and sods where they would have to sit on logs with very little light, and the blackboard was the dirt ground. Life on the frontier was not for the squeamish. There were no doctors, nurses, or hospitals. When women gave birth, usually no one but a neighbor was in attendance. With medical supplies difficult to obtain, maladies such as malaria had to run their course. Injuries were frequent, so residents in Kearney County were fortunate that a woman named Amy Lokes could act as surgeon when necessary. According to the account provided by her son, she closed wounds and with fiddle string and a common needle. Once, with a razor and her embroidery scissors, she removed 3 fingers from the crushed hand of a railroad brakeman. Lilla Day Monroe died in 1929 before she had completed her project. The manuscripts lay undisturbed in the attic of the family home for many years until Joanna Stratton came upon them. She had the pleasure of editing the writings and bringing her great-grandmother's work to completion when in 1981, Pioneer Women, Voices from the Kansas Frontier was published. So you couldn't be squeamish, right? You couldn't be easily sickened by things back then. There were no doctors, no hospitals, lots of sickness. And even if there was someone to act as a surgeon, they didn't have things to use, right? They had to use sewing needles and the strings from a violin or a fiddle to sew up things. It was a very hard time to be alive. But thanks to Lilla Day Monroe and her manuscripts, and thanks to her great-granddaughter for publishing them, now we know a little bit more. Thank you for listening today. We do have links that are related to each of our articles. If you want the link for this one here, you can find it down in the description below.